Every time I come out here, Vinny's doing a job and you're holding his hand.
Me and him split everything. We started yesterday.
Get your hands dirty for a change. Do some welding and grinding instead of watching everybody else do it.
Every bike that needs to get built gets done. Everybody's working at all times. And you know what? 10 years. This is the kind of stuff we've been dealing with for 10 years.
For millions of people, the roar of a custom V-twin engine and the sight of sparks flying off a grinder will always be tied to one image: a father and son standing on opposite sides of a workshop, refusing to back down. Orange County choppers turned two stubborn men into television legends. But what audiences saw on screen was only a fraction of the real story. Behind the chrome, the flame paint jobs, and the shouting matches that made for unforgettable ratings was a relationship that would eventually collapse under its own weight, dragging a family through a courtroom, a decade of silence, and a slow, painful road towards something resembling peace. This is the story of Paul Teutul Jr., the man who helped build one of the most recognizable motorcycle brands in the world, and who lost his father in the process of becoming himself. Long before reality television turned the Teutul name into a household word, Paul Teutul Jr. was simply a kid growing up in the shadow of a demanding father who ran a metal fabrication business in upstate New York. While his classmates spent their afternoons on bicycles or in front of a television screen, young Paul was more likely to be found sweeping up metal shavings or handing tools to grown men twice his size. He wasn't forced into the family business so much as he grew up inside it. By the time other children his age were worrying about homework, Paul was already comfortable around welding torches, grinders, and the constant clang of steel being shaped into something useful. Even his idea of play was different. He would wander through his father's job sites collecting discarded scraps of metal, the kind of material most people would toss without a second thought, and turn them into small sculptures. It wasn't a hobby anyone pushed him toward. It was simply how his mind worked. He saw shape and potential in things other people saw as junk, and that instinct would follow him for the rest of his life. By his early teenage years, Paul had already developed a level of skill with a welding torch that surprised the veteran fabricators around him. He wasn't just imitating what he saw. He was starting to understand the material itself, learning how metal behaved under heat and pressure, how to coax it into the shapes he wanted rather than fighting against it. But growing up in that shop meant growing up under his father's watchful and often harsh eye. Paul Teutul Sr. was not the kind of boss who went easy on his own son to keep the peace at home. If anything, he held Paul Jr. to a higher standard than anyone else on the floor. Mistakes that might have earned a quiet correction for another worker could bring a public dressing down when it was his own son who made them. Some who worked alongside them thought it was unfair, even needlessly harsh. But Paul Sr. seemed to believe that toughening his son up through public criticism would make him stronger and sharper in the long run. As the years passed, the differences between father and son became harder to ignore. Paul Sr. was a product of old-school, brute-force craftsmanship, someone who valued raw strength and get-it-done grit. Paul Jr., on the other hand, had an eye for design, for clean lines and precise detail that went beyond simple function. Those two philosophies didn't just coexist uneasily. They collided. One moment that would later stand out to Paul Jr. involved a simple railing redesign. He had reworked the plans to make it not only sturdier, but more visually striking. His father brushed it aside without much comment at first. Then, a few days later, without any acknowledgement, Paul Sr. quietly used the design anyway. It was a small gesture, but it said something bigger. Underneath the friction, there was real respect for his son's talent, even if it was never spoken aloud. While his peers were preparing for standardized tests and college applications, Paul Jr. chose a vocational track that let him spend half his school day learning technical trade skills instead of sitting through traditional classes. He studied welding methods, learned to read architectural blueprints, and trained himself to understand stress points in steel long before he ever needed that knowledge professionally. One instructor later remarked that Paul seemed to have an intuitive sense for how metal wanted to move, as though he could see the finished shape before a single cut was made. He didn't stop learning when the school day ended. Paul spent countless extra hours perfecting individual welds and cuts until they felt effortless. He never saw a traditional degree as the path forward. His path was mastery of the craft itself, built through repetition and patience rather than lecture halls. When he eventually returned to his father's shop after finishing his vocational training, he was no longer the boy who swept.
I also think that the show did a lot of damage with the family.
Floors and fetch tools. He had become a genuinely skilled fabricator, someone who could speak the technical language of experienced tradesmen and back it up with results. By the time he was 19 years old, Paul Jr. had been given responsibility over the company's railing division, a part of the business that generated close to half of the company's total revenue. It would have been easy to assume nepotism was at play, but those who worked alongside him understood otherwise. He had earned that role by expanding the division's design possibilities and giving the company a more modern, refined identity. Customers began requesting his specific designs, willing to wait longer and pay more simply because his work had become distinctive. Managing a crew of older, more experienced workers, some of them military veterans who were understandably skeptical of taking direction from someone barely out of his teens, was no small task. Over time, even the most hardened among them came to respect his judgment. Paul had taken what was essentially a metal fabrication shop and elevated it into something people in the industry actually talked about. And yet, despite that success, something still felt incomplete for him. After years spent building staircases and custom railings, Paul Jr. began to feel boxed in by the work. He wanted to build something that moved, something with its own kind of life. That restlessness led him to start secretly sketching motorcycle designs in a notebook during quiet moments after long shifts at the shop. Around that same period, his father had rekindled his own interest in motorcycles. What started as a casual request for Paul Jr.'s help on a single build quickly turned into something much bigger once Paul Sr. actually saw what his son had been sketching. The designs weren't just technically sound. They had an artistic quality that caught him off guard. That was the moment Paul Sr. suggested they build motorcycles not as a side project, but as an actual business. It wasn't only about motorcycles. In many ways, it was also an attempt to bridge the emotional distance that had built up between father and son over the years. With roughly $175,000 pulled together from their existing ironworks business, they launched Orange County Choppers. The ownership split, however, was far from equal. Paul Sr. retained 80% of the company, while Paul Jr. held just 20%. At the time, that imbalance didn't seem to matter much. They had nothing but an idea and a cold, unfinished basement full of tools. Within months, though, the motorcycles they were producing started attracting real attention. Their very first build, a blue motorcycle finished with white flame detailing, took 4 grueling months of late nights and constant welding to complete. When they debuted at Daytona Bike Week in 1999, it turned heads in a way neither of them had fully anticipated. They were no longer unknown fabricators from a small workshop upstate. But recognition didn't translate into financial stability right away. By 2000, the two of them were still working out of a cramped, poorly heated shop. Equipment failed regularly. Suppliers demanded payment up front before they would deliver materials. Cash was tight, and it stayed tight for longer than either of them expected. Paul Jr. frequently worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping on a couch inside the shop just to keep projects on schedule. Arguments between father and son were frequent and loud, not staged for anyone's benefit, but genuine disagreements born out of exhaustion and financial pressure. Every motorcycle they sold barely covered the cost of building it. Still, they kept pushing forward, less out of obligation and more because stopping simply wasn't something either of them could accept. In 2002, everything changed with a single phone call. A television producer named Craig Pelagian had seen a magazine feature on their motorcycles and was in the process of developing a new reality series concept. When he reached out, Paul Sr. answered gruffly, and the producer's initial pitch, centered around restoring old junkyard motorcycles, was rejected almost immediately. Their business, Paul Sr. insisted, was about building bikes from the ground up, not fixing someone else's old machines. The idea nearly died there, but the producer returned weeks later with a different approach. Simply filmed the real day-to-day process at the shop, arguments and all, without trying to manufacture drama. Paul Jr. wasn't sold on the concept. He worried that putting cameras in the shop would distort everything they had built and make the family look foolish on national television. He reportedly wrote his father a lengthy letter voicing those concerns. The contract terms themselves weren't especially generous either, with a modest per-episode payment and production demands that included repeated retakes and studio lighting hot enough to interfere with actual welding work. At one point, producers floated a working title along the lines of Family Friction, a name Paul Jr. strongly disliked. Ultimately, financial necessity won out, and they signed on. When American Chopper premiered in the spring of 2003, neither of them could have predicted the scale of what followed. Within just a handful of episodes, the show became a genuine hit, pulling in several million viewers weekly. Almost overnight, two motorcycle fabricators from upstate New York became recognizable television personalities. Their small operation transformed into something closer to a tourist destination. Merchandise sales exploded, and the network reportedly generated tens of millions of dollars in related sales during that very first season. The scale of the business grew so quickly that they eventually moved into a massive new production facility to keep pace with demand. Interestingly, while Paul Sr.'s explosive temper was often what initially drew viewers in, it was Paul Jr.'s quiet, focused craftsmanship that kept them coming back. Audiences responded strongly to watching him work in near silence.
I want to be around my father, but coming out of that unhealthy dynamic, I was able to grow spiritually, emotionally, and just on every level, because I kind of came out from under my father, and then I just became my own guy.
Absorbed in shaping a gas tank or laying out a frame. One particular sequence of him building, without any dialogue or music, became one of the most requested and replayed clips from the entire series. Welding programs across the country reportedly saw a noticeable rise in enrollment, a phenomenon some in the industry jokingly referred to as the Paulie effect. Few builds captured public imagination the way the Black Widow did. It wasn't just another custom motorcycle. It was a statement piece, featuring an intricate spiderweb-patterned gas tank, custom wheelwork, and well over 100 hours of dedicated craftsmanship. When it was unveiled publicly in New York, thousands of people showed up to see it in person, enough that security had to actively manage the crowd. In the months that followed, licensed merchandise tied to the brand, from model kits to apparel, sold in massive quantities, cementing Orange County Choppers as a recognizable brand name rather than just a workshop. Then came a build that carried a weight far beyond craftsmanship. In the summer of 2003, Paul Jr. completed a motorcycle intended as a tribute to the firefighters who had lost their lives on September 11th. This wasn't simply another commission project. Every component of the bike was designed to carry symbolic meaning. The frame itself had to be re-engineered to accommodate hundreds of hand-painted emblems, each representing an individual firefighter who died that day. One of the most emotionally significant elements was a genuine piece of steel salvaged from the World Trade Center wreckage, which Paul personally welded onto a custom bracket rather than delegating that task to anyone else. The bike's significance extended well beyond its unveiling. When it was later involved in an accident, the New York Fire Department reportedly responded with the kind of care usually reserved for one of their own, treating the recovery of the damaged motorcycle with genuine solemnity. To this day, that motorcycle remains on display, having appeared at hundreds of memorial events over the years, with visitors still leaving personal notes and tributes beside it. Years later, Paul Jr. would return to that same emotional territory with a second tribute build, unveiled in early 2011. This time, the reveal drew an even broader audience, including prominent public figures connected to the September 11th memorial effort. One motorcycle stayed as a permanent tribute, while the other was raffled off, with proceeds directed toward memorial fundraising efforts. Witnesses at the unveiling described an overwhelming emotional reaction from the crowd, a reminder that Paul Jr.'s work had, at its best, transcended simple craftsmanship and become something closer to public memorial art. Behind the polished paint jobs and headline-grabbing builds was a technical mind that rarely got the same attention as his design sensibility. Around 2012, Paul Jr. began incorporating advanced modeling techniques into his workflow, that dramatically cut down the time needed to design smoothly curved bodywork, turning what had previously taken dozens of hours into a fraction of that time. That same approach proved essential when he later collaborated on an electric motorcycle project. Other builders in the industry eventually adopted similar techniques, often without much acknowledgement of where the method had originated. A few years after that, Paul Jr. developed an approach to constructing motorcycle frames that reduced overall weight without sacrificing structural strength, a shift that meaningfully changed how custom frames were approached industry-wide. He also taught himself the programming language used to operate computer-controlled fabrication machines, effectively expanding his role from designer to machinist capable of overseeing both the creative and highly technical sides of a build. It was a side of his skill set that rarely made it into the show's editing room, overshadowed by the more dramatic, camera-friendly conflicts happening on the shop floor. The tension that would eventually tear the family business apart didn't erupt all at once. It built gradually, starting around 2007, when Paul Sr. granted his son a 20% ownership stake in the company while retaining full operational control for himself. On paper, it looked like a reasonable arrangement. Father runs the business, son contributes creative direction. But as Paul Jr.'s design work increasingly became the public face of the brand, the balance of recognition began to shift in a way that didn't sit well with the man who had built the company from nothing. Behind the scenes, resentment quietly took hold. Every instance of Paul Jr. arriving late or working according to his own instincts rather than his father's became a potential flashpoint. By 2008, the workshop had effectively become a pressure cooker. Disagreements between father and son weren't occasional anymore. They were a near daily occurrence, almost always rooted in a deeper struggle over control. Paul Jr. wanted room to create on his own terms. Paul Sr. wanted obedience and adherence to his methods. It was a fundamental clash between two very different worldviews, one built on rigid discipline and the other on creative independence. Television cameras captured some of that conflict, but plenty of it happened once the cameras stopped rolling. And it wasn't limited to father and son. Other members of the shop reportedly bore the brunt of Paul Sr.'s temper as well, and the emotional toll on the wider team became increasingly visible over time. The breaking point arrived in September 2008. Paul Jr. was late to work once again, and this time his father's patience ran out entirely. What might have once been a private reprimand escalated into a full screaming match in front of the entire crew. When Paul Jr. attempted to defend himself, pointing out that he always delivered on his responsibilities regardless of timing, his father refused to accept the explanation. The argument spiraled further when Paul Jr. suggested the company would struggle without him. That comment reportedly set his father off completely. In the chaos that followed, Paul Jr. threw a chair across the office, knocked over a trash can, and forced open a door on his way out of the building. His father followed him out and fired him on the spot. What might have simply been a heated argument became something closer to a full rupture, effectively ending their working relationship in that single moment. In the years since, that particular incident has taken on a life of its own online, often referenced humorously, but at the time it represented a genuine crisis for everyone involved. The fallout inside the company was immediate and messy. Loyalties among the staff splintered, with some employees quietly supporting Paul Jr. and others staying silent out of concern for their own position. Customers reportedly voiced uncertainty about whether their custom orders would carry the same creative signature without him. Even the network expressed concern, reportedly warning Paul Jr. that departing the show without notice could constitute a breach of his existing contract. For a brief period, he returned in a limited capacity, but that arrangement didn't hold. By the spring of 2009, his departure from the company became permanent. Rather than simply letting the relationship dissolve quietly, Paul Sr. pushed to force his son out of the business entirely, moving to buy back his ownership stake. When Paul Jr. refused to sell, his father responded by filing a lawsuit. The dispute wasn't only about money. It was fundamentally about control. Paul Sr. argued that a contract clause entitled him to purchase his son's shares at fair market value, then separately pursued an additional claim for damages, even naming the company itself as a co-defendant in an apparent effort to increase legal pressure. Paul Jr., however, wasn't willing to back down. At the core of the legal dispute was a poorly worded contract clause that gave Paul Sr. the right to buy his son's shares at fair market value, without ever clearly defining how that value should be calculated. That single ambiguous phrase would end up determining the direction of the entire case.